Welcome everybody to OAG's latest webinar. Some of you might have deja vu with this title. I think a year ago we came out with a very similar title on the webinar, and I guess the reasons for that are fairly obvious. I am delighted today to be joined by a couple of guests. My name's Deirdre Fulton, for those of you who haven't joined one of these webinars before. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation and have been working closely with OAG for a long time, helping pull together and host these webinars, amongst other things. Joined as ever by John Grant, OAG's Chief Analyst. Welcome back, John. New year, new start or something?
New year, new start, same issues, same challenges, different data points. Yeah, it's never dull in the airline industry, is it? There's always a story.
Good. And I'm also delighted to be joined by a first-time new speaker for us, Michael Jones. Welcome, Michael. Michael's the co-founder of Create Consulting and is a comms and consulting specialist in China. He's got deep experience in working on the China outbound travel market and understanding really what the dynamics are of the outbound travel market in China. So we're really hoping to hear some interesting insights from you today, Michael. No pressure.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Great, thanks. Thanks for joining us. So I'll just go back to the slide deck now. So unlocking global travel, is China the key? We have been asking this probably from very early on in the pandemic. And as I alluded to, we're not quite there yet, and we'll go into some of the numbers as we go. Those of you who are familiar to the OAG webinars know that we like to give the kind of global overview, look at what's happening in the regions, and then go down into the issues. Today, we're also going to talk a little bit about the changes to visas that are happening to and from China. We're going to take a look at some of China's biggest airlines in terms of what's happening to their networks and their orders and capacity. And there's that kind of burning question, well, firstly, where's everybody going from China? And will we really see Chinese outbound travel return back to that baseline 2019 levels? I feel like we're going full circle with 2019. We spent a long time comparing to it. Then we spent probably a similar amount of time saying we're fed up of comparing to 2019. But I think particularly in relation to this market, it's a good baseline. And we're making no apologies going forward for using it in some contexts. You'll notice if you follow OAG's other publications, there are dashboards and regular productions of league tables for a range of interesting things. That we're now moving much more to comparing year-on-year growth. So you won't see 2019 everywhere, but you'll still see it occasionally on these webinars. Let's dive in then. So globally, capacity is pretty much back where it was in 2019. So this month we're slightly below, but if we look on the quarter basis, we're 2.1% up on 2019, and of course, running about 10% up on last year. But as John likes to remind us, and this is a very valid point, prior to the pandemic, the industry was running at 4 to 5% growth year on year, wasn't it, John? And we're missing that growth, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So 4 years of no growth, we're probably 10 to 14% behind where we would have been without the pandemic. We would have hit the challenges that we've seen with Boeing aircraft deliveries. Would we have had the same challenges of the supply chain? Perhaps, but not to the extent we've seen. A lot of good skilled people left the industry and have not come back. And then we've got production issues in other parts of the world. But yeah, it's good to be back where we are, and it gives you a sense of optimism for the next 12 months. But as we've said throughout this whole process, Deirdre, each of the regional markets and even specific countries are at different stages in their recovery, and some are going gangbusters and performing really well. And Africa, and particularly West Africa, is a very small share of the global market, but it's really hot at the moment. There's a lot of activity, new airlines occurring, and in Europe we have a really strange picture where we see some markets that have recovered strongly. Principal leisure destinations, places like Turkey and Greece, have been doing phenomenally well, and you could talk about Turkish Airlines and their Istanbul hub and what they're doing for a complete webinar. And yet, at the other end of the spectrum, you see German domestic capacity down by about 25% as more people take the train, and the inherent lack of profitability in domestic networks is demonstrated, and everyone says no more of that. Similarly, you see that in France, and where Michael is in the Netherlands. The Dutch government have pulled back from their plans for a capacity restriction at Amsterdam Schiphol for this year, but it's not going to go away. It's always going to be on their agenda. The Greens continue to make more and more noise. They probably don't understand the economic impact that they're having on the Dutch economy by trying to restrict growth at Schiphol. So it's a really mixed bag there. In North America continues to grow. We have some fun things to look forward to in the US market. We'll touch on JetBlue and Spirit's situation post last week's developments, but we're seeing less and less regional aircraft flying there. We're seeing rapid growth in the ultra low cost segment. If that's profitable, if it's going to be long-term sustainable, who knows? We're seeing carriers pulling out of hub airports. I was looking at some data yesterday. American Airlines are more than 20% down on capacity in Chicago O'Hare compared to where they were 2 years ago. So there's strategic changes occurring all over the place. And then we haven't even touched on Saudi 2030 and the vision and all that's going to happen there. And that's going to happen rapidly. Well, it better happen rapidly because they need another 200 million people in the next 5 years. So yeah, lots of things developing, bubbling away, and we should really be looking at a year of good, solid traffic growth and capacity growth. But there's always the clouds on the horizon, aren't there? We've got the Boeing issue.
Yeah, there certainly are. Okay, let's go on to our next slide, which takes that, if you spotted in probably quite small text here, the Asia position in capacity terms, pretty much recovered on the face of it. If we take that down a level and look at the sub-regions there, we can see, and some of this you were alluding to in other parts of the world, John, the variation, down at this level and down by country level. Worth noting, I think, of course, China boosted by a very strong domestic markets included in here, as is Japan and other Northeast Asian countries. At the opposite end of the scale in terms of size, Central Asia is really going great guns, isn't it?
It's
50% up on 2019.
Exactly. I mean, it's a fascinating region, and we've been very lucky. We've done probably 3 or 4 projects in that part of the world in the last 2.5 years. And if you've not been there, well, firstly, don't go now because it's -26 and it's a little bit chilly. But the growth in the economy, the transformation that's underway is phenomenal, and that's being reflected in new airlines, in new routes being opened, in extending their trade links to Europe, the Middle East, and back into Northeast Asia as they seek to wean themselves off of a reliance on trade with Russia. So it's fascinating to see that. And it's also fascinating to see the transformation from what was a very traditional airline distribution environment with travel agents to a much more digitized world of online transactions, credit cards, increased disposable income. when we really talk about emergent markets, looking at Central Asia shows what a real emergent market is, and it's only going to get bigger, and it's going to increase its connectivity, and there are some wonderful places to go there as well. Now, I sound like a travel agent.
Fascinating. You do. Yeah, you do. I'm almost tempted, even despite the minus 26 degrees. But anyway, that's a story for another day. Let's look just then quickly at the China side. So, although I guess we could probably have a whole webinar just talking about Central Asia, and of course there's a relationship, isn't there, in terms of the Silk Road and the trading avenues that exist between China and all of these other markets. In terms of international capacity, then for China, this is the missing piece, isn't it? Really. If we look at Q1, so we can see obviously 2019, 8 to 9 million seats in the market a month for China international capacity. Obviously that dropped right off in the years that we're not showing you here. There was a debate this morning, was it the 8th? I feel like it was the 6th of January, but I stand corrected potentially if I'm wrong, when that shock but much longed for announcement came that China was indeed reopening last year. And I think we all, and particularly those destinations right across, not just Southeast Asia, but right across the world that had previously welcomed great volumes of Chinese travellers, hoped for a surge, and we didn't see a surge, did we? We saw a very gradual build up of capacity, and we're still waiting for that market really to fully recover.
Yeah, I mean, it's the hope that kills you, isn't it? The hope of the recovery, the hope of the rapid return. I mean, I think people are extremely optimistic to think that everything would return to normal in 3 or 4 months. Because the international market are completely closed. The regular sort of supply chains have been broken down. The accommodation stock had been released into other markets. Airlines had reallocated capacity. All of these sort of things, and there is hesitancy about the full recovery, particularly from inbound airlines, international carriers who are serving China. It was a tough market to serve during the pandemic. Airlines were being slapped with fines for bringing someone who had COVID on board. I mean, how on earth they'd passed all the PCR testing. What more could an airline do? And yet they were being fined and told they couldn't fly for 2 weeks. Why would you want to go back into that market when perhaps you could use your aircraft to fly somewhere else where you wouldn't have such challenges? So we've had all of these issues. And Michael, I mean, the economy is not in a good place in China, is it, from what you're hearing and seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few things. So first, let me just take a step back, just very briefly. So when China did reopen to the world last year in March, frankly speaking, none of us were expecting it. None of us who were in the industry were expecting it. I was speaking to my Chinese friends and colleagues in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou all the time, trying to get the latest bit of, because this information normally comes out more through a bit of the rumor mill first. And the rumor mill always gets out the information factually correct before it's publicized. And it normally comes a few hours before the big announcements are made. But either way, all of us were shocked. I mean, if you had asked anybody the day before, everybody was still predicting maybe November, maybe December, maybe the next Chinese New Year. So that's the first thing. I just like to point out that China has always had the ability to surprise in positive and in negative ways, but absolutely in positive ways. So the first thing is that they did open. So I think everybody breathed a sigh of relief when that happened. Then the expectations came. It's like, okay, cool. Now we're going to get back to square one within 24 hours. And of course, that was just not possible. Like you say, air capacity was just not there. It was also very difficult for Chinese people to get visas to many destinations. Also, many of the Chinese passports had expired during COVID and they couldn't renew them. So there's a bunch of reasons why when the green light came, people couldn't jump immediately. But that's what it is. I mean, we can use examples of Thailand. Thailand was expecting to attract more than 6 million Chinese. In the end, they got about half. And now people are upset, a little bit disappointed, and they're looking to the future. This is absolutely not what I'm saying, but what I see in the Chinese trade over the Chinese tour operators and the way they're talking, there's quite a lot of talk that naturally for different markets, different things. For Southeast Asia, things can pick up rapidly this year. 2024 can be the year to pick it up. I think the Middle East has a very good chance, if the current conflicts go away, that they can catch up really quickly, because there's a real Chinese interest to go there. But I do think the traditional destinations, and especially long-haul destinations like Europe and North America, are still going to struggle with inbound Chinese tourists to a large extent. I think the first thing that you said, which started off this, it's the economy. Absolutely, it's the economy. The Chinese government came out to said the other day they got 5.3% growth in 2023. Whether that's entirely accurate or a little bit to the side doesn't really matter. It does show a general trend. It does show that the economy is a little bit better than expected. But having said that, we can absolutely see and pick up from many stories in the media. I mean, you talk about like factory bosses who are cutting down on having their haircuts and what kind of clothes they're buying, and they're trying to save on parking money for the expensive cars. Things like that, that doesn't resonate with a strong economy. So the economy is struggling, but I am confident that the economy will pick up. But I think for places like Europe and North America to get to pre-pandemic levels, we're probably looking at 2-3 years. Whereas closer destinations, I think, I mean, again, it can pick up rapidly depending on, is it safe to go there? Are they welcome to go there? Is the visa processing easy?
And that's a big, sometimes underestimated point, isn't it? By destinations outside of China, that the perception of security and safety is really important to the Chinese outbound traveller. Visas are similarly an issue, but I think it's something that's not very well understood.
I mean, sometimes we hear the sort of build it and they will come part of the equation, don't we? And low-cost airlines, certainly in Europe and other parts of the world, have proven if you put the supply on, you can create the demand. But the fact is, China closed to such an extent that it's just incredible to think how much of a recovery is still required. And I mean, Pablo's asked a question here about the US-China market and how much difference does that make? Well, there is still a lot of capacity.
I have a slide that'll show that.
Yeah, there is so much capacity that is still missing. And US airlines have little or no interest in serving anything more than the big 3 cities in China. Yep. And I remember I was in Hangzhou, and there was a United Airlines aircraft there operating 3 times weekly, and it was empty. It was boarding 20, 30 passengers. And if you've got a choice between doing a sector like that, which is taking an aircraft for more than a day and flying it to Europe, absolutely full of people paying dollars, and don't forget 70% of this industry is calculated in dollars and charges are in dollars, and you've got the opportunity to take a little bit of revenue in Chinese yuan, then what are you going to do, guys? And during the whole pandemic, the geopolitical disputes that went on between the US and China meant that frequencies were cut back, and the air service agreement was diluted. And Chinese airlines, yes, would love to fly more frequency to China, to the United States, but the US government and the US carriers are saying, we're not interested. We don't need to see an expansion. We don't see the need. we'll carry on as we are, and until politics, diplomacy intervenes, that's going to be the way of the world.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and we saw last summer significant growth from the US into key European leisure destinations, really replacing some of that capacity that that was previously going elsewhere. This is really stark. On this slide, we're just showing by some key country markets in each of these regions. I think it is actually the top 10 biggest in 2019 and how they are now performing. And then obviously for the Americas, the three markets that were previously served, USA, Canada and Mexico. But, pretty much 20% of 2019 levels is operating currently to the USA.
Yeah, there's madness in this data, Deirdre. Yeah. Bless dear old Flight Radar and other such tracking apps. There are 2 flights from Shanghai to London Gatwick from 2 different airlines that arrive within 20 minutes of each other at the moment. There is why. How busy are they? I'm sure they can't be full. What purpose are they serving? Yes, the Chinese student market to the United Kingdom has grown very strongly in the last couple of years because access to Australia, another political dispute, the United States, 2 of their major final graduate type education locations were turned off, and so the UK has benefited from that. But you just think, what are these Chinese airlines trying to do? Are they trying to find dollars? They're not carrying much cargo because exports out of China have tanked as well. It's a real struggle on the ultra long haul, and yes, Chinese airlines have started services to Saudi Arabia. Why have they started services? Because they're being funded by the Saudi Air Connectivity Program. Is there really a demand there at the moment? Not particularly. Maybe they'll find one, but is it going to be enough for the daily services that are envisaged? Probably not.
But there's a classic example of build it and they will come. Hopefully. And actually, and I'm interested in your views on this, Michael. The whole kind of proposition post-COVID of those who can afford to travel, sort of setting aside the economic concerns at the minute, because what we've seen in the West is a prioritization of travel despite tough economic times. Everything's gone up, from the block of butter to the pint of milk to the car insurance to travel. And we speculated, didn't we, 18 months ago, for quite a long time as to, okay, revenge spend's going to be over soon and no one's going to have any savings left and travel's going to hit the wall. And that hasn't happened. And what we've seen is people have a newfound desire to travel because we couldn't for a long time, and it's a shift in patterns and decision making. I guess the interesting thing from a China perspective is if you have the funds to travel and you have a passport, because only I think my stats of 10% of the Chinese population still only have passports. Is there a shift in where people want to go? Is it now about, if I'm going to spend the money, I'm going to go and see the Northern Lights or try and see the Northern Lights, or I'm going to go and visit an important cultural heritage site in Saudi or wherever that takes me. Is there that sense of sort of travel becoming adventurous, perhaps more than was there before?
That's a good question, actually, because this is actually being debated in our industry quite a lot right now, and it certainly started during COVID. So, like during COVID, when you saw the first Chinese people inside China, starting up glamping camping sites and doing glamping, people were getting to glamping or whatever, and then people sort of writing about it, and of course there was a lot of cynicism about well, is this really a trend? Or is this because you're in lockdown and you've got nothing else to do, kind of thing? So, but it did. So there was a lot of cynicism about it, but I think it has evolved since then to become somewhat of a trend. Look, one thing that you can also talk about, first thing for the Chinese market right now, the sector that still remains incredibly beautiful and attractive is the pensioner market. People that are retired, so they've got their time, they've got their money, they can travel. So this is the one group that really hasn't changed in China right now. I mean, it was always fun and exciting to talk about the Gen Z and millennials before this, but obviously it's absolutely the Gen Z have been most affected by youth unemployment now. And even to a large degree, the bottom end of the millennials are being affected by the Chinese economy. But the pensioners have cash and they want to travel. And during COVID, they must have also had some kind of internal debate with themselves, because they really have come out punching as the gates have opened. I mean, so recently, I just saw a bunch of data of groups of Chinese travelers going to Africa and doing more budget type safaris. And the age groups are literally include people that are in their 80s. And this is not luxury. It's not particularly comfortable. It's a little bit rough. So yes, there has been, I think, a change, not necessarily only to adventure, but more nature-based tourism. And yes, there's a huge debate that the Chinese travelers now want to collect more experiences and memories more than Gucci bags. I'm not going to settle that debate, because really it goes here, it goes there. But these things absolutely are popping up. So I think that if you are offering something more adventurous, something more natural, more nature-based, that can be for older clientele, I think you're in a good place right now for the Chinese market. I don't think it's doom and gloom across the board. Absolutely not. I think everything's in a good place to improve, but it might not be at the rate that people expect it to. But there are sectors which are glorious right now.
And we've touched on the past, the Chinese travel ecosystem and the influence of people like Fliggy Travel and Alibaba and these people who are offering high-end, what we would term as luxury type sort of product and services, continue to have considerable influence in that age category, in that demographic profile that you're talking about. They've got the ability to literally get people off their sofas and on an aeroplane.
Let me give you a funny, strange, cute little example quickly. In the West, people love to rage against the machine with TikTok, right? TikTok is destroying all of our youth. They're destroying the. But so in China, you don't have TikTok. That is actually banned. But they've got the parent version, Douyin. And fair enough, the content style is very different. And what's allowed in TikTok certainly is not allowed in Douyin. But what I find fascinating is that some of the smarter international destinations out there, are specifically purposefully making Douyin, and therefore, let's call it for now to make it easier, TikTok-styled videos targeted at pensioners. So they'll spend the same ad spend, and to make these videos, of course, we know it's not cheap. You need producers and whatever, and they'll make slick videos, but it's not targeted at the teenagers. It's targeted at the older folk, and I find that absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And just kind of building on what we were just saying previously, Pablo in our audience is affirming that there was a great Antarctica season from China in 23-24, and the numbers are looking great for 24-25. And this is not budget travel, No. So it kind of it illustrates what you were saying about that being a really resilient segment. Thanks, Pablo, for that insight. I think what's interesting is you've almost got this kind of landscape emerging, haven't you, where you've got a segment of the market who has money, willing to travel, is willing to blow the budget on, super experiences, ticking off the bucket list stuff. But then you've got a whole segment of whatever generation, maybe it's the poor millennials. Don't often hear people say that, do you? Or the Gen Zs, who now have less funds available, and are perhaps the market that Thailand, some of the Southeast Asia economies are targeting. And we're seeing this kind of situation emerge. I'm just going to come onto my next screen, where you've got a flurry of visa relaxation happening, almost the reverse from what we had when countries were closing by the day and stopping travel to reciprocal travel arrangements all over the place. We've seen from China so far this year, at the end of last year, visa-free travel for 5 European countries, Malaysia for a year. We've now got visa-free permanent arrangements to Thailand from China. Ireland and Switzerland were added to that list. It feels like, as a sort of external to China observer, that China has never been more accessible. And there's a huge competitive play going on amongst all of these source markets to make it easy for people to travel. I guess recognizing that the economic situation is making that tough. And you've got a big domestic competitive market now, haven't you?
Absolutely.
Lots of fun, great things to see in your own country.
Absolutely. I mean, as a person, I mean, as a person that lived in Beijing for 18 years and I had to reapply for a visa every year or every second year, to now see that guys can willy-nilly just arrive at the airport with their passport and walk into the country, it's unbelievable. It's truly unbelievable, which shows the degree to the pragmatism that China still has in its armory. Again, their ability to surprise. I never saw that coming, I'll be honest, but I think it's absolutely fantastic for them. I think that's the way China needs to go back to becoming easier again, absolutely. And it will work for them. But yes, I think you are right. It also does show that for them to have that level of flexibility, they clearly want to see dollars coming in as a result of that.
It's just pragmatic, isn't it? I mean, you can't afford, if you want your tourism sector to recover, to put barriers in the way of travel. I mean, in another continent, I travelled to Africa at the end of last year, and I had to get a visa, and it was a multiple entry visa. And I've been told, even though it says multiple entry on it, I have to go back in a couple of weeks' time. You have to apply for another visa. Now, doesn't make it easy, doesn't make me feel that I want to go, and all of those sort of things, So the more you ease it, then the better it is going to be for everybody. And if China, which is one of, professes to be one of the most closely watched societies in the world with cameras on every crossing, can do this, then you've got to think most other countries in the world must be able to adopt similar strategies.
Absolutely. I mean, one small example, I remember very distinctly, it was, how many years ago? Anyway, I was invited to attend to talk at a tourism trade fair in Morocco. And I had to join the queues I was living in Beijing, and I had to join the queues like everybody else. And it was impossible. That queue just didn't move to get a Moroccan visa. It was really painful. And I also remember seeing these Chinese agents jumping on their moped, going and getting 2 other visas in the time where we were still queuing, and then rejoining the queue. And I remember feeling very frustrated and writing an article about it and saying, like, well, this is just this is nonsense. If you just give these guys visas, they're going to come. The next year, miraculously, absolutely nothing to do with my article, I think maybe 2 people read it. The Moroccan government did make it easier for the Chinese tourist visas, and Chinese tourism, and maybe it was also the perfect storm, a connection of things. But the next year, Chinese tourism to Morocco grew by 235%. And it was just so often, like with African leaders, they're often, well, how can we get Chinese leaders? I'm like,
absolutely.
Well, give them a visa on arrival.
And those four Chinese tourists that arrived in Marrakesh had a wonderful time, didn't they? But it is about that complete freedom of movement, isn't it? And that is, I guess, to the issues in places like Thailand, you can do everything you want. You can waive visa requirements, whatever it happens to be. But ultimately, it's all about the economy. And if the economy isn't right, then people aren't in a position where they can travel. And it doesn't matter if you're in China or if you're in the United States.
Exactly. Absolutely.
I think what's interesting to kind of just pick up on that to some extent is we come back to our next slide. This is possible, I guess, because the extent to which China outbound is served by Chinese carriers who have a vested interest in serving that market.
Yeah.
We were interested. We were talking last week, weren't we, about the extent to which there was a sort of 50-50 split in what was operated by foreign carriers versus Chinese carriers. And actually the numbers high level show us, so this is all Chinese international capacity, that the balance is greater.
Yeah,
we
nearly all have a preference to fly with our national airline, unless you're British, and it's, the options are British Airways, or in Michael's case, you're South African and you don't now have a major international airline.
Moving swiftly on.
Let's
not talk about either of those airlines today.
No. But the whole market has, and the growth that you've seen in 2019 and up to 2019-20 was predicated on Chinese international airlines growing their networks, adding destinations, not just the big three, but even, the second tier airlines were Hainan Airlines, Junyao Airlines, Spring Airlines were starting international services because they were serving the outbound international Chinese market. And because, other foreign airlines, non-Chinese domiciled airlines, have found other ways to deploy their assets, put them into use elsewhere, relocate them in Europe, or send them to other parts of the world. It means that, every time someone says to Virgin or British Airways, what about Shanghai, or what about Beijing, they've got to say, well, actually, do we want to drop a US destination to fly there? We're making good money and good contribution here. Do we actually want to put more investment into China? Why don't we let our Chinese alliance partners bring the traffic to Europe, and we'll carry it within Europe for them, or other ways of working.
And that's really behind these very, very high shares, isn't it? So this
absolutely. And of course, the Russian overflight issue doesn't help. 2.5 hours longer for a European airline. And if you're on some days, you're coming back over the North Pole from Europe, from China back into European airspace. So all of those things contribute to what we're seeing. And it was interesting, even before the pandemic, European mature legacy long-haul airlines were saying we can't compete with the Chinese airlines cost base. Their salaries, their staff, their cost, 30 to 40% cheaper. And that's reflected in the selling prices.
I think if we, this kind of illustrates hopefully what we saw in 19, where, so here we're just looking at the destinations that were served, just everywhere excluding Asia Pacific. And there's a number, the US is a good example of it, but probably because it's less busy than looking at the Europe and Middle East picture. But, you had this raft of destinations that were being served, and I sort of hesitate to call them secondary destinations, but to some extent secondary destinations if you go beyond the main big US hubs. And these have not come back yet in the same way. And if we stripped this down, blew it up a little bit just to look at Europe, we'd see the same story. There's less concentration of services, isn't there?
And this is still a 3, maybe 5 year recovery process that we'll see go in place. Some Chinese airline will take a gamble on Las Vegas at some point.
See what you did there?
Yeah, I did. It was very good, wasn't it? And those secondary cities in China. The other thing is we don't appreciate, and I keep saying this, secondary cities in China have populations that are larger than London. They have populations that are larger than Paris. They have a desire to travel internationally. You know, we will at some point reflect back and say, you know, why have we not seen these coming back earlier? Because these are big markets and they can be served. And when you've got next generation 787s and 350s and lower seat cost, you know, less emissions and all of these sort of things, these destinations will come back into play at some point.
And I guess the timeline for that though is impacted by all of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the economy, the share of generational groups that have access to travel.
It's about priorities, isn't it? I mean, 2019, Chinese regional governments were paying millions of dollars for European airlines to commence routes to their cities because it was seen as a prestigious, status-driven type sort of thing. Everyone in the industry remembers BA's service to Chengdu that stopped 1 week after the World Routes event was held in Chengdu. I mean, it was a classic, never going to make money. Why on earth were they doing? I mean, maybe it was for BA staff to see the pandas on rebate tickets. I just don't know, but it's just madness. Some of the things that have happened, and they will come back again in time, inevitably.
Let's take a look then at China's biggest airlines. Although we've talked a little bit about them, because I think certainly, we have seen, as you were saying, there was this big expansion of lots of secondary carriers into China, and I think if we matched up somehow this information against the destinations served, I think it would be obvious. Largely the big carriers are back, and they're mostly back in the destinations that they were operating to before, with some exceptions. I think what's interesting is obviously domestic sort of is the story that it is, and it continues. And relatively, the share operated by those big three carriers, Air China, China Southern, and China Eastern, is quite similar to what it was in 2019. Internationally, they're operating a bigger share of a smaller, a smaller market. I suppose the question is, there are clouds on the horizon. We know this, not just in terms of resources, and we know that there are issues, and these are global issues in terms of maintenance and the supply chain. Just in terms of how long an aircraft is going to be out for in a maintenance schedule. But the 737 issue is a very real one, isn't it? And it has a ripple effect for China.
It's an issue for everyone. It's it's not China specific. Indeed, it's a very US centric issue at the moment. Although Michael O'Leary at Ryanair has expressed confidence in Boeing and their production and delivery schedules. And yesterday, Scott Kirby, CEO at United Airlines, cast doubt on whether they'll actually take the MAX 10, given the production issues and delivery schedules.
5-year delay, isn't there? Potentially, at least.
Yeah, and Chinese airlines, were one of the last to allow the 73 MAX back into operation, and they've already ceased and grounded the 737-900 MAX. So, it impacts what you can do. And maybe this is the opportunity that they've always waited for COMAC and the COMAC aircraft to grab a share of the market. I think that's not going to happen. It's a duopoly of supply from Boeing and Airbus. Both have had their challenges in terms of deliveries. Boeing's clearly got some more structural and process issues that they need to resolve. They're really under the microscope of the FAA at the moment. And for the moment, airlines will just continue as they are. But it's very hard, if you're an airline CEO, to plan your network when you don't know when your new aircraft are going to arrive. And then, of course, that ripples down and impacts the release of aircraft that you had planned to return to lessors, because you have to try and get those aircraft on extended leases and keep them in your networks. And you have to pay a premium for that because those aircraft are in scarce supply. And we were talking about that in December on the previous webinar, and we'll come back to it, I'm sure, at some point in the near future. But when you think about these airlines, and particularly in China, where a lot of the revenue is being generated in relatively soft currencies or weakening currencies compared to the US dollar, and yet most of your operating costs, your lease cost, your fuel, are all in US dollars. That's not helping them in their recovery as well. That's a drain on cash that's been going on for 4 years, nearly 5 years now.
I think there's just also this issue of, just back to the MAX for a minute, relatively small orders due this year in the context of the wider, the wider piece of what's on order. And we know that Chinese airlines in particular are very agile at deploying aircraft where they're needed. We saw that, didn't we, throughout the pandemic, where wide body aircraft were being used on high density domestic routes. But I guess there's a point at which, isn't there, that potentially recovery is stilted by these kinds of problems in the supply chain.
It's just another bump in the road, isn't it? It's another pothole on the A23. You have to get around it.
Very niche reference, John.
You have to find your way around these sort of things, and the industry does. But it doesn't help anyone in terms of their planning and their confidence. And of course, in the short to medium haul market, it's these type of aircraft that are supporting and creating the demand and the capacity to places like Thailand. Thailand is a perfect short haul single aisle sector out of China from nearly everywhere.
Nicely onto my next slide, John, which was about the ambition of tourist targets across Southeast Asia. And I think the challenge is that, and we sort of alluded to this earlier, didn't we, that actually the competition for the Chinese outbound traveller has never been more intense, has it? And that it's being impacted by different things, isn't it? It's being impacted by disposable income and lack of it potentially. But actually, that in itself is going to lead to competitive fares, isn't it? Pursuing it where.
I just sit here and I wonder, if you are a potential Chinese international traveller, you've got all of these options in Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Australia, visiting friends, family, relatives in Europe, wherever it happens to be. You've got all of this product choice, and you add on top of that the Saudi 2030 vision and all of the heritage opportunities and all of these things. You must be sitting there thinking, who wants my money? And who's going to be the most price competitive for that particular journey and that particular experience? And Michael, do you actually see that happening? Do you see there's more competition on price in China than there was previously?
So absolutely. I mean, especially right now because of the economy, people are looking for a discount. And not only are the consumers looking for a discount, but the actual tour operators and the OTAs, they looking for discounts. So if there's international tourism products out there that have a nice discount, China's a good place to go knock on the door right now because they are absolutely looking for that. In terms of this competition, I mean, the Saudi thing is very interesting. I mean, so the base level, I think the Chinese outbound traveler has naturally more of an inclination to find the Middle East culture and history visiting more interesting than the West. They seem to be more happy to jump on an airplane and go there. Whereas, I mean, like, for example, in the West, if I tell people I went to Tehran on holiday, people raise their eyebrows. But Iran is actually quite a popular destination for Chinese tourists. It really, really is. So the Saudi proposition is actually really interesting, but it hasn't been tested yet. So we'll have to see. Obviously, Saudi is going to be like a bit of like we can look a bit at what's happening with Chinese tourism to Jordan. We can look a little bit of Chinese tourism to Dubai, a little bit like, and mix a little bit. That's kind of Saudi and bigger. So that'll be quite interesting to see. And no doubt, Saudi is promoting themselves more than anybody else in China right now. They're pushing themselves really, really hard. But yes, like you say, I mean, like if we're on 3.5 million Chinese tourists to Thailand this year, I mean, to have a higher number that for Saudi in a few years, it's a bit of a, yeah, it will be a challenge to achieve that. They absolutely will need all the connectivity that you've been talking about today, because sure, that's a lot of seats to get people across. But nevertheless, it is interesting. I mean, Southeast Asia obviously is, and places like Thailand, I mean, you couldn't create a better destination for the Chinese tourist. They feel so comfortable. It's so easy. Many more international-minded Chinese now actually see Thailand pretty much as a second home already. They travel there so often. Australia, before all the geopolitical things and before COVID, was also remarkable. The Chinese tourism to Australia was absolutely fantastic. I mean, over 1 million, clearly. Still trying to figure out, is it Australia tourism doing such a great job at promoting themselves, or is it also just because there's more family and friends actually studying and living there? Is there a bit of that on? Is there a bit of the student things? Well, we're not entirely sure. But again, what blew my mind and impressed me about the Australians were when they were told, oh, yes, we get over 1 million Chinese tourists. Their attitude was fantastic. It was like, oh, that's not enough. We want double, we want triple that. What I mean is that they really saw that the potential is there and they were going for it. And then unfortunately, COVID then kicked in. But what I mean is a lot of destinations do sell themselves short. They don't necessarily reach for the stars. They don't necessarily see the opportunities. And everybody, of course, pre-pandemic, I mean, of course, China was your golden ticket to get good tourism. So, yes, I think there's going to be an immense amount of competition there. But as things improve the economy, it will be better for everybody.
And we heard this morning, in fact, and for anyone listening who wants to, the recording of, we generally do two in a day, or sometimes we do 2 in a day. And this morning we heard from our guest, who's based in Australia, that actually the Chinese traveller in Australia was worth 3 times that of any other nationality. Interesting to think in the context of what we've been talking about this afternoon, is whether that will continue to be the case, or actually you'll have a more budget focused traveller, or indeed a traveller who is more focused on those experiences and spends on experiences rather than on luxury items. And there's a kind of circularity there, isn't there? Is it good news for the airport operator? No, it's not. If there's less money to be spent on the gifts and the duty-free products, but it's good news for a destination if there's more spend on tour operators and experiences that are being provided in market. I think it's going to be interesting, isn't it, to see how that does pan out.
Yeah, everyone is still going to want the Chinese tourists. But it's down to that destination marketing. It's down to creating the right product at the right price point and positioning itself. And you can't argue with the imagery that Saudi Arabia is putting out all around the world at the moment. I mean, it's fantastic. They don't actually tell you where it is until the last second. But that's going to inevitably change over time. But just going back to that, the context of China and Saudi Arabia's aspiration for 300 million, even if they were to get 3.5 million visitors from China per annum, I mean, the level of capacity that will be required to operate to and from Saudi Arabia and China compared to what there is now is a phenomenal increase. We're going to be talking about 20 wide-bodied aircraft a day going to various points in Saudi Arabia to accommodate that demand. And the other question, of course, is how directional is that going to be? Because is there going to be demand from Saudi Arabia that wants to go to China? Michael, I'm not sure that there would be that much.
Yeah, from the Saudi point of view, I've got no idea. Clearly, I mean, I wouldn't know much about that. But I mean, look, I mean, it's also so. I mean, I'll use another example. So, for example, one of the countries that we've worked pretty closely with in the past is Jordan Tourism Board, and Jordan is just a remarkable tourism product. The Chinese that have traveled there love it. They absolutely, they actually prefer it to some of the neighboring countries, which are apparently more popular. But there's never been a direct flight between China and Jordan, and believe me, we've been trying for years, and it's either Royal Jordanian can't do it, but also at the same time, the Chinese airlines couldn't get it right either. So from both ways, nobody really wanted to commit. There was definitely a bit of concern and passivity from both sides. But I'm pretty confident that if there was a direct flight to Jordan, Chinese tourism numbers to Jordan would double.
I think that's one of those classic markets where a piece of vertical integration in the travel distribution system in China, and a tour operator takes a 6-week charter program into Jordan, creates a demand. 6 weeks one year becomes 10 the next year, becomes 15 the next year. Suddenly, you've got a seasonal service for 20 weeks or even year round. Yeah. There's plenty of cargo that needs to go into Jordan as well. It's just getting the right distribution strategy to make that happen, and the price point, because I know personally Jordan is not a cheap country for hotel accommodation.
Okay, I'm slightly conscious of time. We've got 3 minutes left, and we did want to just have a very final, though we've talked a little bit about the MAX 737 MAX issue. We wanted to just briefly mention JetBlue and Spirit. John, your thoughts on that? What does this mean for JetBlue? Really, I guess.
Back to the drawing board. I always worry when an airline gets caught in that mid-market position. Where it's and there's all sorts of carriers that have been there before. Swissair, Sabena, where your product proposition isn't the lowest cost in the market. And equally, although you have a great product, it's not as comparable to a full-service carrier with everything that they have and the frequent flyer programs and the brand loyalty and all of those sort of things. And I fear that JetBlue is falling into that classic mid-market position, which makes it challenging for them. They've got extreme competition on one side, the ultra-low-cost carriers, which is why they've been talking to Spirit and wanted to see the deal go through there. And then you've got at the other end, more and more transatlantic capacity coming in from people like United and others. And they have a very domestic network, of course, which has always been the case. So I think they've got a new CEO. She's been there a long time. She'll have her views, and she's got to start working them through pretty quickly. But challenge for them. So that's an interesting development to watch in the US market. I think another one in the US market is what is going to be the ultimate impact of the recent problems with the plug. No plug and you go down the sinkhole, and that's what's happened to Boeing with their MAX 9 problem. And you can see here, this is the rate of cancellations. Now for Alaska, 25% of their fleet has been impacted by this, and you can see that compared to their original schedules, they've been running with cancellation rates of about 15% all the way through January, which is from the 6th of January when the incident occurred. For United, who've got a bigger fleet, clearly they've been able to reallocate assets and, you know, adjust their schedules accordingly. So I think that it just highlights how an airline can be impacted so quickly, and, you know, the revenue loss at a time of year. If there was ever going to be an event like this, you know, one half of me thinks 2nd, 3rd, 4th weeks of January, it's a good time to happen.
Yeah.
That's when
Get it out of the way.
get it out of the way. Demand's at its lowest point, all of these sort of things. The other half of me thinks, I don't know when this is going to be sorted. I don't know when I'm going to have my aircraft back. I can't get visibility around that. It's going to roll on into February, and February becomes March. And, you know, Easter this year is in March. So you need to be careful of that as well. So that could hit demand. It's a worrying time, I think, for the airlines and indeed for Boeing generally. But we'll see how things shape out. But I hope JetBlue finds a way through it. You know, when I've flown them, they've been a fantastic airline with a great product. But they've got some challenges ahead this year for sure.
On that cheery note, we're out of time. But I'd like to say a big thank you to Michael for joining us and sharing your insights on the fascinating Chinese outbound market with us. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen. For those of you who have been listening to us today, you will be able to access the slides and a recording of the webinar later. That'll be available, and of course you can pick up regular insights on OAG's website on a whole range of interesting industry topics. So Michael, thank you. John, thanks as ever for joining us, and we'll see you all on the next one.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye.